When Oliver Came to Town. In the east of England sits a dreamy town, time has forgotten. Dotted by a river, its occupants live a simple life. But that does not mean there has never been stress or strife. For centuries, the town has remained in its bubble. Gossip runs wild, and the talk of how someone's got their clothes so white, or how a local lad they all know by name has been caught pinching pennies from where they shouldn't. It was news like this that occupied the forefront of their minds, and spilled from their lips as they spilled their beer in the local pubs. What happened outside this town was its own kind of nonsense, and nobody cared about that. But on one night, a still silent summer's night at that, the big bad world came knocking on its door. Our story begins in the Ship Inn, named due to the punters all being sailors. They wouldn't be seen dead in the Pig's Head, for example. That pub was for farming folk, and that was that. 4 men sat around a table beside the bar after hours. They'd been celebrating the wedding-to-be of George Haig's daughter. The Combs boy had asked him just that afternoon if he could have his daughter's hand in marriage. George had been stood at the bar, and what he remembered most was the deep blue of his eyes as he tentatively thumbed his hat in nerves. The truth was, George knew the Coombs lad and his little Dorrit had been seeing each other. He had watched them by the river, the Combs boy regularly helping them fetch the family's water, and he had noticed the long walks they had been taking in the fields that surrounded the town. So to be quite honest, he knew the question was coming. It just caught him a little sooner than expected. "You think you're the one for my little Dot now, do you?" he said, planting his beer in front of him and wiping away his very wet moustache. "Have you been on your father's ship yet? How are your sea legs, lad? They don't look good to me," said George, peering from his side eye down at the young lad beside him. The Coombs boy could only look down and thumb his hat some more. If he had looked up, he would have seen Big George's smile appearing under that soaked moustache. But before he could, Big George brought back the dark ale to conceal the smile. The Combs boy looked up now, and George continued. "On the small side, aren't you, boy? What happens if some dandy farmer boy comes down for my Dorrit? Would you fight for her?" James Wilson, the landlord and old friend of Big George, grinned as he poured a pint of his old special ale for a punter at the end of the bar. He could hear the whole thing, and he knew what Big George was up to. "Absolutely, sir. I would go to the end of the world for Dorrit Haig." "That's better. Bit of life from you, young lad." "A little lad picking away at his hat and looking up at me with big blue eyes. It's not exactly filling me with confidence, but a boy that can fight. Now I'm interested." The Combs boy began to smile as his eyes wandered around and his subconscious filled with dreams that began to fill his mind. "But can you fight, boy?" said Big George. The Coombs boy started thumbing away at his hat again as he looked up at Big George. Well, the thing is, sir..." "What would you do if I walloped you good now, boy?" said George, slamming his fist down on the bar. The whole inn went deathly quiet. Then, from a nearby table came a voice. "Pa, everything okay over there?" asked Big George's son Ricky. "That's enough now, George," said James Wilson, the barkeep pouring another of his ales. "Put that young lad out his misery." "I dunno, Ricky boy," said George, turning around to face the entire pub. "See ya, this Coombs boy," said Big George, putting his arm around the lad, whose head almost disappeared in George's armpit. "He's asking for your sister's hand in marriage." Everyone in the pub was fixated now. Big George was known to be a good man around town, but nobody was counting how many ales he'd had that day. And a big man about town is capable of anything after too many, as is any man. But when he's a big man, well, it makes bigger news. "Is that right?" said Ricky Haig, throwing down the great hand of cards he had and walking towards the bar, standing on the other shoulder of the Combs boy. Ricky Haig was the same height as his father, but thinner, and he didn't have the same great white beard and moustache. The only other difference was the colour of the hair. Ricky's black, his father's white. but both were thick locks to be proud of. The two Hegmen sandwiched the Combs boy. The pub watched, and the Combs boy shook and dropped his hat. Big George kicked it away as he went to pick it up. "What do you think, Ricky?" The two were actually the same age, but to look at them side by side, you wouldn't believe it. "I dunno, Pa. What do you think?" Big George Haig pulled in the Combs boy tighter. The young lad perceived it as a threat, as Big George grabbed his ale. "I think my little Dorrit is getting married," he roared, raising his beer high and downing it. The whole pub erupted into cheer, and raised their beers too. "You're a bloody good lad," said George, holding the Combs boy close. The Combs lad began to cry, but it was the last thing he wanted Big George to see, as he brought his hat to his face. "Never mind that, lad," said Big George, snatching the hat from his hand. "James, get this man a beer." "Aye, don't worry, this one's on the house. What you have it—" "Scratch that. Stupid question," he said, pouring the local ale he'd been pouring to this man for the last 10 years. The whole afternoon, the inn had been alive. A right royal booze-up had begun. Arms were thrown around each other, and beer had been spilled. But now, under candlelight, after hours, with barely a noise heard, sat 3 men beside a table at the bar. Big George, James Wilson, and Ricky Haig. They still sipped beer, but the drunkenness had faded. Big George should have been tired, but a small smile was omnipresent upon his face. "You know, George, that Combs boy, he's not a bad lad." George smiled, more obviously now. "Wait till I tell my penny. No, the Combs family are good people, a proper family, sailors like us lot. Nah, now I think of it, I couldn't be happier. I've always liked the Combs, me. Me and his old man sailed a few times together back in our younger days, and I liked him then, and I like him now. I said it once, and I'll say it again. They're a good family," said George, drinking another sip of beer. That tasted better now, at 1 a.m, than it did when he walked into the bar that morning. "You're not wrong, George. I remember Peter Combs well. We spent a few days together once. It was so random. Both selling that nasty drink from Holland we'd both acquired. We're selling it in Lincoln. Well, none of them dandies wanted it. And when we saw each other and, realised we wasn't having any luck, we both decided to walk back here, drinking that nasty drink under the stars. My God, we were hammered. Woke up in a field in Lee. Farmer come out. Well, you never guess what? Offered us eggs. For brekkie. Every time I see him now, we laugh about that. About 30 we was," said James Wilson. "Well, to be honest, that's quite refreshing to hear. The Combs lot, they're normally quite proper people, but, yeah, likeable. Ricky, lad, you're the same age as that Combs boy. What do you know about him?" Ricky Haig, a little worse for wear, looked into his pint. He's a good boy," he said. "Well, that's it," said George. "Yeah, Pa, that's it, and that's a good thing. I mean, normally I have a tale to tell about most folk in this town, but Combs here, no, straight shooter, does right. I don't know what to tell you, really." That smile remained on Big George's face. He didn't let on, but his son's story was exactly what every father wanted to hear about the man his daughter wanted to marry. It was at that moment there was a big bang on the door. The 3 men looked at one another. This banging was different. It wasn't a knock of people frequenting. It was a demand. And then again. James Wilson tentatively raised from his seat. "You want me to get the gun?" said George. No. I'm sure there's a perfectly reasonable excuse for a man at this time. If he wants a drink, though, he's got another thing coming. A man with an army couldn't make me pull another pint tonight." James Wilson, a little stiff, began to walk towards the oak door of his inn. There was a little trepidation, but this was a small town where everyone knew everyone. There must be a good reason for the late call. Probably someone just needed a little help. He opened the door. Stood there with a lantern, with the flame illuminating his face, was a man. "Evening, my good fellow." Immediately James could tell he wasn't from round here. He didn't just sound like he wasn't from here. He didn't look like he was, facially. "Sorry, lad, we're closed," said James, shutting the door. Then it came to a sudden stop. James sighed as he looked at the man's fancy boot, stopping the door from closing. "George, go get the musket." "Right, lad. Look here," said James, opening the door again. James was now taken more back as he looked at the man more in detail. The midnight visitor was dressed head to toe in metal armour plates, and in his opposing hand, the one not holding the lantern, was a sword. "Right, if this isn't the King of England, then this man is to get himself off," said Big George, coming up from behind him with the musket. "The thing's loaded, son. So if you don't want to end up a bloody mess, well, you get off," said George, just about able to focus on his target. He really had drunk a lot of beer today. "George, just, take it steady now," said James Wilson again, looking at the mystery man's attire and the sword. It almost looked fit for a "Who the bloody hell are you?" blurted out George. "Chaps, I don't mean you any ill harm tonight, but it's been a very long day for me and my men, and, well, a beer would go down tremendously well. What do you say?" George and James looked at each other and wondered if they was dreaming. "I don't see any men," said James, peering over his shoulder. "Oh, I'm sorry. My most sincere apologies. Please, step out and just look here. Please," said the southerner with a warm smile. George, the musket, and James stepped out of the familiarity into a world that seemed all the more alien than ever before. "Take a look at the old chaps. They've had quite the day, I must say." George and James's attention was immediately drawn to the left. Normally it was drawn to the right, where the River Trent flowed and fields of gold reached out to the horizon, where oranges and purples winded together, not fighting, but dancing, making colours the imagination could never conjure. No, tonight they looked out to the great fields. Oranges glowed in the night, hundreds of them, and there was a hum of humanity. They could be felt more than seen. Somehow you knew they had had a tremendously long day. "Obviously, I don't expect you to tend to the whole lot, but a few would appreciate a beer tonight to help them sleep." Big George all of a sudden dropped the musket. These were two men who were used to seeing the trials and tribulations of their small town. Who had stolen from who and who'd had an affair was enough to keep the folk talking for a year or two over their favourite beer. But this, it was beyond words. An army. "A few barrels for the boys. What do you say?" "Who are you?" said James, gathering an ounce of sense. The man came forward and offered his hand. "Cromwell, Oliver Cromwell." When George and James walked back into the inn, they saw Ricky behind the bar, helping himself to another ale. "Don't worry, James. I'll put it on the side." But didn't get a response. George and James just went back to the table they'd been sitting at by the bar and sat down, looking like naughty schoolboys who had gotten their comeuppance. "Pa? What's up?" said Ricky, bringing over his beer, spilling it a little. The two older men didn't respond. It was then a group of men walked into the inn. George and James just sat there looking at their beers. Oi! What the hell do you think you're doing? Shouted Ricky. But as he looked back at the ghost-white faces of his dad and friend, he noticed how the men were dressed, armour and all, and he quickly went quiet. They took their barrels and left, and when they did, they had the strange politeness to close the door, gently. A strange silence took over the inn, and the three men looked at one another. Big George was just about to announce it might be time for him and Ricky to go home, when the sound of a cannon was heard. Immediately, George and James, a little longer in the tooth, and hearing the sound once before in their early days on sea, they hit the ground. Ricky went flying back off his chair and landed in a heap in front of the bar. "What was that?" said Ricky. "No, they're not firing on the town, are they?" said George. Then all three men on hands and knees began to cross the inn. They made their way to a small far window, and from there they could see what had befallen the sleepy little town. Ricky almost fainted. 100, if not more men on horse were charging under the moonlight across the great field, as hundreds of soldiers ran for their lives, their screams only detectable on their faces, not heard over the thunder of running horses, and the occasional cannon fire. The three men watched until the last fire of torch went out, and they heard the last cry of a man being slaughtered. Again, a strange silence befell the inn. "I really must be getting off," said Big George. Though he said this, neither of the three men dared move for several more minutes. Then came a big knock on the inn's door. Slowly, together, the three men approached the door with not a word spoke. James Wilson with a musket in hand, and either side the two big men. Ricky reached open and pushed it open. Stood there was a man with long black curly hair and dark eyes, and an elaborate robe round him with a fancy white collar, and on either side of him was two men, both with big brimmed felt hats and long feathers in them, wearing breast armour and swords on their waists. Then the regal-looking man in the centre spoke. "Sir, you may rejoice. The town is the king's again." "Hurrah! Hurrah!" said the two men at his side. George, James and Ricky stood there, mouths aghast. "I say, we couldn't trouble you for an ale, could we? It's been a terribly long day," said the man in the middle. "James, I'm going home," said George Haig.